Nee, Christo, glad nie. En goeienaand. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to yet another stream. I've lost count of them out. I'm joined this evening by Christo Harting from the Free Market Foundation. Christo is a big time free marketeer, analyst, overall rational person. A champion of rationality. His counterpart, Martin, unfortunately couldn't join us this evening because Martin has got the coof. But he seems to be giving the virus quite a hard time. So we expect Martin to be back soon and with us. Christo, good evening. Thanks for joining. And we actually set the stream up long before the brouhaha hit us. So our topic is probably needs a bit of amendment for relevance.
Gideon, always a pleasure to get to talk to you. Thanks very much for the opportunity. If in the introduction you mentioned me as this rational person, and if Martin is my counter, then I'm assuming he's the emotional one. So that's good to know that that's how you view the two of us. Yeah, look, talking about the topic, I suppose it bears out a lot of stuff that you've said over the last year or two, and that some of us have sort of dovetailed with you on in terms of when things get bad, when the S hits the fan, if you have your firearms, you're better able to protect yourself and your family and your community, regardless of what happens on the macro level. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to influence the macro level in a more pro-freedom direction, but at the end of the day, as we've seen the last 2 weeks, when the forces come for you, you need to be able to protect yourself.
That's the thing. And I think I had the pleasure of discussing this with David Ansara on Sunday evening, is that there is a huge safety and security vacuum that now exists. And it's still in existence. I mean, there were reports again this afternoon of the SAPS and Metro allegedly withdrawing from, I'm going to tell you now, I forgot the name of the suburb, Hammersdale in Durban, where they were overwhelmed by protesters and looters again. And the communities that I speak to in Durbs essentially say, look, they cannot bargain or count on law enforcement to actually be there and provide the necessary law enforcement resources when things go very, very wrong. And the only people they could count on were themselves and their neighbors and so on and so forth, hence why those structures exist. And I suppose you need to be thankful those structures exist. But this is also something the Free Market Foundation has been championing for a long time. I mean, you guys have been spreading a message of resilience and anti-dependence, so to speak, on government. Maybe tell us a little bit more about, what does resilience mean in your context, or rather from where you're coming from?
I'm sure a lot of viewers and listeners will be familiar with the concepts of anti-fragility and state proofing. And this, I mean, what the sort of policies some of the policies for which we try and advocate and influence are part of those concepts, and the idea of, and this isn't just the case of the current ruling party and the current government, but whoever's in power and whoever has that political power. I mean, ultimately, government is supposed to be a monopoly on force, on the use of force. Government is supposed to protect individual rights from the ideal monarchist perspective. I mean, ideally, these things, we could talk about idealism and that kind of thing. That doesn't mean it actually shakes out, but that's the ideal conception. Government is supposed to use police, the army, the courts to protect your individual rights when someone else uses force or fraud against you. Now, even in the ideal society, that never happens optimally. We run into the problem of government hubris, of the folly of the central planners. This is something that Friedrich Hayek did a lot of work on and pointed out. You can have very benevolent, very knowledgeable people, the bureaucrats in Pretoria, Bloemfontein, Cape Town, with all the data of how people interact and how they work with each other. But at the end of the day, they can't plan all of our lives for us. And when things don't happen according to the ideal sort of setup, it falls on individuals and communities to protect themselves. Now, I think South Africa has unfortunately been heading in this direction for a while. We've had declining economic growth. At the moment, we've got over 42% unemployment, over 11 million people unemployed. And for all the talk of the violence and the looting was instigated by one individual, or at least his network, quote unquote, I think it does us a disservice to discount factors like poverty, hunger, inequality, that kind of thing, and to look for the government-created barriers that exacerbate those problems.
Yep.
And that make it more difficult for people to sort of lift themselves up, as it were. People are told repeatedly, you have less because someone else took it from you, because someone else has more. It's a very zero-sum thinking. So we shouldn't always be surprised when people try to take matters into their own hands. It doesn't justify violence, it doesn't justify destruction or theft or anything of the sort. But it shouldn't surprise us, and we should try to figure out what policies will set South Africa on a better path of economic growth where people are able to create wealth for themselves. And again, to go back to the whole anti-fragility point, it almost, not that we shouldn't try to influence what happens in the centers of power, but it shouldn't matter so much that you focus all your energy on that. You should be thinking of ways in which you and the people around you can tackle the problems that affect you. I mean, something as, it sounds cliched and basic, but something as basic as a broken street light in your street. What does your community do to fix it? The potholes. We know that municipalities are in a lot of trouble. I think earlier this week, I think now all the major municipalities are in junk status in terms of their credit ratings, which makes it more difficult for them to spend and more difficult for them to repay their debts, which again means increased rates and taxes. So the cost is passed on to the ratepayers again, and they don't see the benefit for that.
Yeah.
So you need to decide
increased rates
for this line. Sorry.
For fewer services, just to summarize. You're getting shafted, folks. There's no other way of putting it.
Even if you got the services in the first place, I mean, we know that that's also been declining over the last 10 years or so. A lot of money has to go to blue light brigades and VIP protection services and that kind of thing. So any way that you can, quote unquote, take the power back and not be reliant on the state makes you less dependent on the state in small. It doesn't have to be huge ways. You know, we can talk about stuff like secession, and maybe that's coming down the line and 10, 20, 30 years, depending on what else the ruling party does. But by taking back power, you almost secede in your own small ways. You take the power back from the capitals, as it were.
That's the thing. And I'm so glad you actually brought this up, because we've been seeing ceaseless talk since the weekend, since the president spoke, of the so-called insurrection, that this was a planned mastermind action, completely ignoring the fact that we've been in the longest sustained economic downturn since World War II, completely ignoring the fact that the lockdown over the past year and a half has done not irreparable, but incredible amounts of economic and social harm. The fact that analysts were warning that an event, just as we saw the past week, was not necessarily imminent, but was, for all, beating around the bush talk, going to happen if we continue locking the country down. I mean, Davy Rood was quite vocal about it in April last year, if I recall correctly already. I'm paraphrasing now, but he said, if we carry on, the country will burn. Yet, if the government had to admit that their reforms were not up to standard or just non-existent or stagnant, that the economic lockdown was a terrible idea, that makes them look bad. So it's much easier to say, oh, this was a masterminded insurrection by these people that were so incredibly powerful. They managed to just arrange this, at the drop of a hat.
And just on that insurrection point, I mean, President Ramaphosa on Monday in his latest address, I mean, he, in so much as I've ever heard this administration take ownership for its failures, he admitted that the security and intelligence agencies were ill-prepared and didn't see this coming. But at the same time, they managed to foil an insurrection. So I'm not really following. So you're ill-prepared and under-resourced, and you can't counter an insurrection, but you somehow manage to prevent an insurrection. So it doesn't really hang together for me very well.
Well, the thing, exactly, what prevented the so-called insurrection, or what actually held the Sea of Chaos back, were anti-fragile people that had formed networks and institutions and infrastructures that enhance their anti-fragility, whether that's informal neighborhood watches where people just took stock of who their neighbors are, what they can do, what their abilities and equipment are. And a lot of this obviously backed up with guns, because firstly, you're not going to ever give anyone humanitarian or medical aid in a dangerous area. The area first needs to be secured, and for practical intents and purposes, the people who are going to be securing that area are going to be people with guns. And Variable Vision asks, so Martin isn't with us tonight, it's Christo, but, or Chris, there are many, there's much water that needs to go under the bridge for the FCA amendment to pass in the first place, if it passes, if it even gets that far, and even then there's much to go on. I think the focus mustn't be on, oh, is it not? The focus must be on participating in stopping it, because the people are the neck, even if the government is the head, and the neck can turn the government where it needs to be. And I think what we've seen the past week in Soweto, Soshanguve, most of Durban, Pietermaritzburg, and the North and South Coast, is that you would be crazy in this country to allow civilian disarmament to happen if you are a guy with a gun. Chris, your opinion on what you see, in between those scenes, the good, the bad, the ugly, the hopeful. It's an open mic, so you just go wherever the conversation goes.
Yeah, never give a philosopher an open mic, because then it's going to be another 5 hours. I don't know how much time you have this evening. It's a good thing we're both in our respective homes, so we don't risk getting caught by police roadblocks when we drive home. Look, it's great to talk about the abstract theory of rights, of individual rights. I mean, part of my work is discussing both the moral underpinnings of individual rights, of that framework, the sort of Western tradition, as it were, but also, how these rights applied. And I think in the South African Constitution, we don't have an explicit, for example, Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms, an armed militia, that kind of thing. But it just goes to show you, many South Africans, what's written in their hearts and in their spirits, and how they work together, despite the rhetoric of the last, not even the last 20 years, because people like to say, look how bad things are, of the last 100 years or last 200 years of governments in various forms trying to divide people, trying to tell them that your problems are caused by another group of people based on the color of their skin. We saw people coming together because their homes, their families, their communities, their businesses that they've built up were threatened, and they worked together. Some of them, of course, brought their firearms. And that is a way of concretizing your rights. So as I mentioned, the great discussions, and I'll never want to give it up, that sort of talk about abstract rights and what they mean and where they come from. But you need to be able to back them up and use them. Now, if the amendment bill is passed, I'm hoping that South Africans, don't let it reach that point. But if it does, just because it passes doesn't automatically mean that people fall in line with the government, quote unquote. They might try to find other ways to circumvent it. As we've seen with various things, just the last year with the ban on alcohol and tobacco, the more government tries to ban things in a way, the more they create an appeal around it, and the more they encourage, quote unquote, black market or illegal behavior. This might lead to more dangerous behavior down the line. So, for example, instead of making it easier for responsible gun owners to be licensed and to follow the correct processes, to be well trained, they're just going to make it as difficult as possible, if not impossible, for people to own a firearm. And they're going to find their own ways to do it. And there's no guarantee that it's going to keep firearms out of the hands of criminals and thugs who circumvent the stuff anyway. I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but there were reports in the last 2 weeks of ammunition stores being looted in Durban, for example. So, and these were ammunition stores supposedly guarded by government and the police.
Yeah, that is exactly what happened. About 1.5 to 2.5 million rounds. I'm still waiting to determine what the total number was, but it was several shipping containers worth. And the story behind the story there is that prior to the riots breaking out, the importer told the police, you need to do the inspection and release the stock so we can move it. And the police kept just not doing the required inspection. Then the police, I can't remember what happened next, if they informed the importer to move the stock to an adjacent shipping yard off the harbours, out of Durban Harbour directly, or but nevertheless, the police, they did two things. Firstly, they refused to release that shipment of ammunition to the importer to take possession of it. And secondly, they instructed the importer to move it to a location. At that location, on the Sunday night, I think, or on the Monday, it was then looted for over the period of 2 days. As the harbor was looted, the looters got to it. The importer could do nothing, and now the police are trying to, sort of blame the importer for the ammunition being stolen after refusing to do their duties. The importer did everything it could. I think Barry Bateman ran the story on ENCA. I'll try and reference back to it. Just to answer Dylan's question, I wasn't referring to the government not assuming disarming citizens. I'm saying that citizens would be crazy to allow themselves to be disarmed by government under the present circumstances. So the onus, as it always has been, is on the private individual to do what is necessary to prevent state predation. And unfortunately,
various people are going to try and undermine what communities have done in the last 2 weeks. I mean, people are going to they have already couched some of the behavior as vigilantism, quote unquote, reckless behavior. I mean, if one in general followed the argument of people who want all guns to be banned because firearm owners are generally reckless, I would have expected to have seen a lot more vigilantism and violence in the last 2 weeks. I would have expected to see proper, Gotham style from Batman and the comic books, like that sort of just anarchy on the streets kind of thing. And we didn't see that because I would say, based on the evidence, gun owners are responsible and they try and do the right thing. It's not like they were just arbitrarily shooting at each other or at random people on the street. They communicated, they tried to figure out what was going on. And again, it's community specific. So a certain threat might look a certain way to certain communities, and that they made the most informed decision that they could. That doesn't mean everyone is always going to act in the most optimal way, but it's better than someone trying to centrally control them from Pretoria and saying, exactly, oh, erect this barrier here, do this thing here. You and your communities know best what the issues are, where the choke points are, where you should do what you should defend or not. And I think that's very admirable. I mean, to me, it'll always, government and other commentators will always try and undermine people taking matters into their own hands. But for me, if someone is threatening and perpetrating violence against you, your family, your property, it is your inalienable right to defend your property, regardless of what it's called. I mean, then it's just semantics about vigilantism and whatever. I think it's very admirable what people did. And they showed what happens when South Africans, when they're threatened and what they can do together.
That's the thing, and I think it was very dishonest and disingenuous for the commentators in question to label these people militias or vigilantes. I like the term militia in its original concept, which is an organized body of men. But again, a militia is under the control of some sort of authority. These weren't. These were independent associations, voluntary associations of men and women who got together for the sole purpose of protecting their neighborhoods, their immediate neighborhoods and adjacent space from harm, from a very real and easily defined threat. And they did so with great success, with wonderful discipline and cooperation. And I think that was a testament to exactly as you said. There was no, if these people were truly the irresponsible, trigger-happy monsters they made out to be as a whole, there would have been oceans of blood and dead people. Like every checkpoint would just have been a mass shooting event. And there was not a single checkpoint that was a mass shooting event. Yeah, things got a bit raucous in Phoenix, but guns weren't involved in that violence. That was a whole separate thing. And there are historic dynamics there that I'm not qualified to go into in order to explain further. But I think something that you could add lots of value about, Christo, is this concept that unless it's written in the Constitution, you don't have that right. That's not how rights work. So tell me a bit about why that's not how rights work.
Unfortunately, at the moment, I think we, in general, in academia, in the commentariat, in society generally, we focus too much on positive rights. So, for example, you have a right to X, so a house or Wi-Fi or a car. To me, if someone else's labor or time or skills are required to provide you that thing, that's not a right. You can't have a right to someone else's time or input or work. Otherwise, you imply that you have a right to their life. And, that I don't see how rights can go that far. I delineate rights as in terms of negative rights. So my actions, I can do what I want freely as long as my actions don't incur force or fraud on someone else. So my rights, as it were, end where their rights begin. And it's a very, I don't even think Western concept necessarily, but just human concept of your sort of sphere of influence, as it were, your right to action. If you look at, and this is getting, metaphysical, philosophical, that kind of thing, but if you look at what separates us from everything else on the planet, it is our ability, and sometimes our inability, to use reason. And you can only use your reason best to survive, to figure out the world around you, if you're free to do so, free from force. Now, what is one of the ways that you protect yourself from interference by other people? It's through being armed, for example, whether that's a club or a firearm or a machine gun, take your pick kind of thing. I think, libertarians, we would all want nukes in our homes, but
I was about to say we can go full Joe Biden, nukes and F-15s. I mean, I'm open for that.
No, exactly. So it's that idea of, it's all well and good to say we have things like freedom of speech, freedom of engagement, freedom of association, but those things are only important, and those rights are only important insofar as you can use them when people disagree with you. So it's not great when you have the freedom of speech to say X, but if the government disagrees with you, they come onto your property and sanction you, or they take away your children, or take your pick kind of thing. The right to free speech is good insofar as, and useful insofar as, it protects disagreement, as it were. One of the ways to actualize and concretize that right of disagreement is through being armed. On the question of property, I think we should link this always to the right to keep and bear arms, your right to own your body, your right to life, your freedom of association, and your right to keep and own what you've earned through, again, voluntary interactions with other people, not through force or through fraud. And then your ability to protect that. And again, to sort of concretize that in terms of when people come onto your property, you have the right to defend that.
That's it. And I also very much prefer the concept of negative rights, because there's something that what the law does not explicitly prohibit, it allows, is a concept. I think it's in South African law. It works like that. That is why when people say, oh, but where in the law is it written that X, Y, Z is allowed? And the answer to that is, well, nowhere, because what you're allowed to do isn't written in a book of statutes or laws or legislation. It's the stuff you're not allowed to do is written in there. And
I also
sometimes
hope that people, I would hope that for many people, morality isn't just defined by legality. So what's on the statute books, as it were. I mean, just because something is illegal, quote unquote, or is legal, doesn't mean it's moral. I mean, Nazism was quote unquote legal in Nazi Germany. That doesn't mean it's in any way moral.
Yeah. There were a lot of terrible things that were entirely legal and still are. And there are a lot of good things that are illegal, depending upon where you are, who you are. So that's an absolutely valid point. This fallacy, though, where they say, okay, but the right to own guns it's a privilege, not a right. The question must always ask, but who extends that privilege to us? And if it's the government, then what is the government, and what grants them this ability to extend privileges to citizens? That's not quite how this thing works. But that is that's a repeated argument that's being made. So how would you fence that, Christo?
Yeah, look, I'm familiar with that argument, and it comes up every often because we, unfortunately, a lot of people fall into the idea that that your rights are granted from government, as it were. For me, rights are underpinned by natural law and natural law theory. They exist in all times and in all contexts. Just because, let's say, the majority of South Africa, let's say 99% of people said, yeah, your right to own a firearm should be taken away. That doesn't mean it's invalid. Majoritarianism and majority views don't override individual rights. Don't automatically just wipe them away, as it were. Those things are inalienable for a reason. All it is government sort of codifying them, as it were. And you would hope a legitimate moral government does just codify them. At the moment in South Africa, I think we're going in the opposite direction, unfortunately, where it's very, very much a case of, if you want X, Y, and Z, vote for us, accept what we tell you, and then we will, quote unquote, protect and guarantee your rights, as it were. So it isn't any more a case of rights being inalienable. It's a case of rights being goodies or sort of handouts from the government, unfortunately. In terms of the privilege argument, in the same vein, you could say, well, then the right to life is a privilege. So the government, who's the government to take it away, as it were, or not take it away? So you need to, I think what you raise is very important. Always ask by what standard and who should give you this privilege. Are there any objective ways to measure it? Does it say it's 50% of parliament? Does it say it's 50%, 75% of the cabinet of the day? Does it say it's the Minister of Defense or the Minister of Police? At least press the people who are making these arguments and ask for some sort of objective criteria, because something as vital as the right to defend yourself and your family, the bar to remove it should be incredibly high. And the the burden of proof should always rest on those who want to take away your rights, not on the natural law, as it were, and those rights being natural.
That's exactly it. And, when we say, okay, but it's the minister grants you these privileges, it's like, by what power does the minister grant me a privilege? None of these things, as far as I'm aware, been codified or quantified in any sort of legislation or procedures or anything in South Africa.
That's just you being unreasonable.
That's just me being unreasonable.
Unreasonable questions.
Exactly. So, but I like this concept of, well, not rather, I like the concept. I'm a huge proponent of natural rights. I find it personally difficult to explain to somebody what a natural right is and where they come from, because there's a very deep philosophical root. But fortunately, I have you here tonight, so I can ask you this, and you're going to put it much better than I can. But Christo, what is a natural right? Hello, Germ. Thank you for tuning in.
I think Germ I think we should end on that note. Germ is absolutely correct. As is Prof. Malan. I'm working my way through his book. Unfortunately, I'm working through the Afrikaans version, so it's going to take me about 5 years versus the English.
I just want to say to Germ, I hope he is studying, because we're busy with his competency for him and his wife, and you need to study and come. It's time. You've had the books for a long time. No excuses. Sorry. Okay, that was me being teachers. Sorry, Chris. Carry on about the concept of natural rights and its origins.
Yeah, I mean, this reaches back to people like Aristotle, Aquinas, others throughout the history of moral philosophy, ethics, that kind of thing. It's based on the idea of human nature. And I mean, this will upset some people, obviously, but there are some objective ways with which we think of human nature. And as I mentioned earlier, one of those is by using your reason. And if you aren't free from interference to use your reason as you see fit, I mean, you're going to make mistakes. But if you're not free to use it, then you're not sort of living your goal, your reason, your purpose, as it were, your telos, to use again from Aristotle. I mean, if you think about this can be a bit reductionist, but the telos of an acorn is to become an oak tree, kind of thing. For me, the telos of human beings is to use their reason to live lives of flourishing and of purpose and of progress and to pursue their own happiness. I mean, very much codified as well in the American Constitution. That's why I consider the American Constitution probably the only moral constitution that has ever been sort of devised, as it were. So if someone asks you about natural rights, just think about some ways in which humans are different from all other species and animals on the planet, and what we need to use to live and to survive. Other animals have developed their claws, that kind of thing. We have to use our reason. Again, we don't all use it very well all the time, but we have it and we need to use it. And for me, that forms part of the natural rights sort of picture, as it were.
Well, that's a beautiful explanation. That's a wonderful way of just boiling it down into easy digestible. What shall I say? Something that we can put out there and people can hopefully absorb and use, because it's a very deep philosophical discussion. I'm glad you brought up the American Constitution, because it's very much what the founding fathers wrote in that original document. has become very applicable to the Republic of South Africa the past week. I think as many people woke up to the fact that a large sort of paternalistic central government that claims to be benevolent is not the way to go if you want to pursue happiness, if you want to be productive, if you want to build generational wealth, or even if you just want to live in a form of reasonable safety and security, because those organs have all failed miserably. But now that we have citizens that are being a bit more active, or rather taking a bit of a more active interest in unscrewing this, where do you think we should go with this, Chris? Like, how would it be possible to decentralize South Africa, to federalize it, so to speak, to federalize policing, to federalize all these things? Or is that a pipe dream of someone who's being naive?
No, I don't think it's a pipe dream at all. We've seen it happening. We've seen the processes in that vein play out in the last 2 weeks. Now, they might not be where, I as an objectivist would want it to be, the sort of ideal decentralized point, or where colleagues who are anarchists or more hardcore libertarians want the state to be as small as possible. But almost in a way, regardless of the grand schemes and plans of the bureaucrats in Pretoria, South Africans keep on. They keep on trying to solve their problems. They keep on trying to solve issues and work together. And we saw these processes play out in the last 2 weeks. I'm hoping that in various ways going forward, people join civil society organizations. I mean, off the top of my head, I can think of AfriForum, Solidariteit, Gift of the Givers, other security organizations, that kind of thing, and just take back some of the power from the state in small ways and train themselves to look after themselves and the people around them. I mean, even through COVID-19, and we can have discussions around whether it's serious or not, but I think we can definitely say that the best way to tackle a pandemic isn't through central edicts from the state. I'm reading a book, Economics in One Virus. It's a play on Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. And the data points that people in the US, I mean, it's focused on the US, but that people started adjusting their behavior way before official government edicts came down that they had to lock down. So people tried to figure out for themselves what the information was and how they should adjust their behavior. Whether they were correct or not, they tried to take responsibility for themselves, and they didn't wait for government. I mean, government inevitably is behind the curve, and when it does impose things, there's always this ripple effect of unintended consequences and damages down the line. We've seen in the last year how much lockdowns have affected supply chains. I mean, the fact that the N3 between Johannesburg, between Gauteng and eThekwini is still somewhat operational after a week of violence and looting shows you just how resilient supply chains are, no matter what governments try to do. Goods and services are always going to want to try and flow. If you can find ways to tap into business, into your community, how to make sure that you have the right connections, that you work with people who value you and who you value, who you can sort of match with, as it were, then it shows you can be resilient no matter what the state tries to do. Now, if the government starts rolling out tanks and that kind of thing, obviously it's a different matter in terms of how resilient you can be. On that note, I mean, we can talk about the meltdown at Denel, another South African state-owned enterprise. It has debt of around 3.5 billion rand and cumulative losses of nearly 5 billion rand. So, for example, Denel manufactured products like the Rooivalk, the G6, and revenue has plummeted from 8.2 billion in 2015 to 2.4 billion in 2019. So even our armed forces aren't necessarily going to protect us that well. We saw last year what happened, of course, unfortunately and tragically, with army personnel enforcing lockdown regulations in some township areas and South African citizens losing their lives for something as basic as drinking a beer on their own property. So yeah, I wish it wasn't the case that South Africa was in the state it is now, but we see the ideology of the government playing out around us. Its policies of centralization, of national democratic revolution, have brought South Africa to this point, and citizens are still trying to make the best of it. So whether things get bad or whether they get worse or get better, you should have processes in place that no matter what, you can still in some ways have a good life.
That's exactly it. That and I think that's precisely where we are trying to go, because there are many organizations. I think Variable Vision mentioned them: Sakelige, SAI, DAG, Organized to Restore Supply Chains. I mean, that's all free market, like private sector stuff. That's none of that is government mandated, or even, thank God, government controlled, because otherwise it wouldn't have worked. On the rollout of the military, tanks coming to your neighborhood, they are still struggling to up the number of SANDF personnel deployed to the so-called hotspots from 2,500 to 5,000. 5,000 troops is nothing. It's for the size of a metro like eThekwini. It's nothing. For the size of two metros like Johannesburg and Durban, it's basically wasting time. You're only deploying these in targeted operations. I see they have infantry fighting vehicles, but there are 4 people in them. They rolled out the Rooikat, which is essentially a tank destroyer. It has absolutely no effect on trying to quell unrest. It's not useful for that task. It's almost as if the military shot its load last year during lockdown enforcement, and the resources to deploy it internally do not really exist anymore. They've been spent and squandered. And with the tax revenues that went down the toilet as a result of, the alcohol ban alone is just, Chris, do you have any figures on it? But it's billions and billions and billions of rands that are just gone. They'll never come back.
No specific figures off the top of my head, but we can assume, tens, if not hundreds of billions. And let's say government lifted the latest alcohol ban tonight. That doesn't mean automatically that's going to come back up. People have adjusted their behavior. And again, this idea of the central planners knowing how people are going to react, the hubris of them to think that they could turn off a sector of the economy, turn it back on like a switch, like a light switch, and they'll just collect all the revenue that they did before. That's folly of the highest order. And it's very pleasing in a way. You want government to in some ways, and again, don't tell any of my libertarian colleagues this, but in some ways you want to collect some revenue so it can provide services to truly indigent citizens based on South Africa's history, who really have no outcome, who are desperate for any assistance. So at least focus on that, not bailing out state-owned enterprises and that kind of thing, and funding blue light brigades and VIP protection services. So ultimately, it's poorer South Africans who are going to suffer the most from government's own lockdown policies, which is ironic. And you hope that people slowly but surely start to see how these things are interconnected. I know, for example, I was working on a piece on trade, and the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, it should be called the Department Against Trade and Industry and Competition, Minister Patel, he of banning cooked chicken and flip-flops, he said that yesterday in an advisory, the department said that they are now announcing exemptions from the Competition Act for certain businesses. So in terms of pharmaceutical manufacturing, other warehousing, manufacturing, supplies, because they want businesses to be able to recover better from the looting and the violence. And I just wish they would make this permanent. Why not make it a permanent exemption? It's government acknowledging how important supply chains are, how important businesses are for job creation, wealth creation for people's lives. I just wish they would make these things permanent.
Well, this is the thing that they don't seem to get is on just the alcohol situation. I do not know a single person that has stopped drinking since the alcohol ban, because the black markets, or rather the informal markets, are now so well established. They are so efficient. They are not overpriced. I saw a price list circulating for bootleg alcohol. It's not really bootleg, it's just tax-free alcohol. It's legitimate stuff. It's not far inflated above the market price, maybe 10% if that, which means that that indicates to me that for the amount of risk that people are taking moving the bootleg alcohol around, they are moving such volumes of it that their markup and their margin above market doesn't need to be all that high, which means that they've actually succeeded, probably, Chris, and correct me if I'm wrong, they've probably already created a parallel industry that even when they lift the booze ban, will carry on operating because people can now get alcohol delivered to their homes. They don't, things that the law prohibit anyway. When we go back to normal, why would they go back to buying alcohol and paying huge amounts of sin taxes on it? So a huge amount of tax revenue ain't coming back. It's not coming back.
No, and it's irrational from government to think that this sort of thing will just come back automatically. I did see we had one question in the comments which I wanted to throw to you before you put it on my shoulders around what happens when ISIS comes into South Africa and how do communities handle it. So I'm going to throw that to you as the security expert.
Well, the thing here is also that the dynamics of ISIS in the north of Mozambique not being a spontaneous popular uprising, but also part of there's as we spoke earlier, there was definitely major tinder there and sparks, but a lot of that stuff's foreign funded. But let's say ISIS wanted to make the north of KZN a caliphate. The only thing that would stop them, and that would stop them very effectively, is the armed local militias, especially if you organize, train, and equip them. Those are people with the skin in the game. That is our counterinsurgency north of our borders is highly successful. Yes, you do get the counterinsurgency operators, but many of them have great success because they train the local population who have lost family and friends to the terrorists, that have an emotional, I would say, buy into this idea, and they become extremely effective and very loyal counterinsurgency units that do great work. This is why the wheels fell off in Nigeria, because the Nigerian government, and this is entirely separate discussion, the way that they treat their troops and the way that they're trying to fight Boko Haram is just shocking. It's actually I'm actually surprised there hasn't been some sort of popular uprising or successful coup in Nigeria yet, based on that. But to now segue to Bernard, who said, instead of fighting the stupid FCA bill, is it not time for a complete new system? It is indeed. And I think we would be stupid not to try and, with all the success recently, push through on that. Chris, from the Free Market Foundation's experience, have you guys had much luck pushing through reforms from your side? And how difficult has it been, or rather, how has the process treated you?
So, two examples I can point to, and this isn't specifically on the on this amendment bill, but two other areas in terms of electricity and land reform. So, the foundation's biggest project is Kailam, which focuses on facilitating the transfer of title deeds to people who have lived in homes for generations but have never owned the title deeds. And this is a very real way of making property rights real for people, and how we sort of try and show them, try and show those South Africans who live there and also others the uplifting that happens in communities when people own their property rights, when you don't run into the issue of, the state owns it, so no one's responsible for it. When people own their homes, they try and take ownership, they improve them, they, in different ways that might be very superficial, but at the end of the day, they take ownership of it. They try and make things look better, and they want to leave something for their children. So that's one area which we've had a lot of success, and which we point to everything which will be undone if South Africa implements expropriation without compensation. The progress that has been made since '94, and there has been some progress, we should acknowledge, that'll all be undone if we go ahead with amending Section 25 of the Constitution. Another area of success which we count is in terms of electricity, and the recent announcement by President Ramaphosa to allow the self-generation up to 100 megawatts. Now, we're waiting on the gazetting, we're waiting to see the details. This doesn't mean that government's actually going to implement it, and as always with government, we can have nice edicts and speeches and plans, but it doesn't actually come about in reality. So we need to see if government actually does this, because this is the first step towards breaking up the Eskom monopoly, the state-enforced monopoly. I know people love talking about the evils of monopoly in South Africa, but the Competition Commission, oddly enough, never focuses on government-enforced monopolies. Unfortunately, they focus on private, big businesses, as it were. So those are two areas where we think we've made some progress. In terms of this amendment bill itself, I think the last 2 weeks have shown pretty much that gun control is, as the bill tries to sort of get it about, is dead in South Africa. Citizens took the power into their own hands. They defended themselves and their communities and their businesses, and they showed that regardless of what government is going to do. I mean, they didn't. People in these communities in Durban, for example, who are defending their businesses that they've built up over years, because building a business takes a long time. Breaking it down can happen overnight, but building up takes. These people didn't sit around on a Sunday night and wait for President Ramaphosa to say, "Looters and violent people, you stop. Now you shouldn't do that anymore." They didn't wait for that. They simply realized what was coming, and they took the necessary steps to prevent that. And I think that's going to continue. I think more and more people are starting to see and to realize the more you wait on government, the more you're going to suffer when things break down. The more you're dependent on government, the more you're going to suffer when government either uses that against you or simply, falls by the wayside. It's not going to be government coming to help you. It's going to be private organizations and people in your community across all races and religions, creeds. And again, that to me points to the sort of centrality of self-defense and property rights and that kind of thing. It was all South Africans of all stripes taking ownership of this. We can obviously talk about the issues with taxi associations and some of the stuff they do, but a lot of them also try to help their communities defend their property.
Yeah, no, and that is exactly it. And it was a universal concept of, I'm going to protect the people closest to me who I care about. I'm going to protect my home, my livelihood. And by extension, that meant a positive externality of such action is you're protecting the homes and livelihoods and lives of other people. Whether or not that was your intent, I mean, we don't need to ascribe morality to it. It is moral anyway. But I think for people living in Cape Town, what happened in Durban is difficult to fathom. Not all of them, thankfully, but there are a great number of people who live in the Ferris Cape who have not at all or very infrequently traveled up north, and they don't understand what it's like to live in a non-functioning municipality. Because the city of Cape Town, for all its faults, is an extremely well-run municipality. The Western Cape is a very well-run province. That sort of level of state predation and dysfunction doesn't quite exist that led to everything going wrong, which has now gone wrong the past week. And that is a difficult conversation to have, Chris. You're in Joburg. Life is much different there. You have a series of very important challenges to your daily life. How would you, to someone who's completely uninitiated, how would you describe how you live in a dysfunctional municipality?
Well, it's very much the ideas and the sort of the everyday that people take for granted. I think a lot of us who live in the quote unquote West, the broad West, the sort of idea. I mean, just earlier today, I shared this graph which showed the decline of extreme poverty over the last sort of 100 years. And I think a lot of people take that prosperity for granted, and they take the ingredients that bring that prosperity about for granted. They assume it's just natural, it's always going to be there, but you need the right structures in place, and you need the right government policies in place. You need a minimal state, as it were. You need the rule of law. You need strong property rights, freedom of speech, and freedom of association. And all those things, on average, produce better quality of life for more people than not. Those countries that go in the opposite direction, unfortunately, have worse lives, have worse quality of life. And we can see this all around the world. This happens regardless of sort of people's religion and race background, that kind of thing. So when you see a municipality breaking down, things like refuse collection, waste running in the streets, potholes, wherever you drive, regular load shedding, that we should start calling it rolling blackouts and not just load shedding. And of course, security concerns. In a way, having high walls and electric fencing and guard dogs and all this kind of thing, it indicates what sort of vibe and what the broader context is. Why would people need to implement that stuff? I mean, some people would just want to live behind high walls, and that's their prerogative. But for many others, they do it because they know they can't rely on the police services. They can't rely on the police to come and defend them. I mean, there's that line of the police aren't the first responder. You are your own first responder, as it were. And I think in many cases that's playing out more and more in Johannesburg and places like that. So I hope that for people in more affluent and better parts of South Africa, and indeed all around the world, that they learn the right lessons from countries and areas such as South Africa, Gauteng, Durban, that kind of thing. And what happens when you don't address issues in the first instance, when you say, oh, it's just a case of reform within the governing party. It's a case of, let's just get the right person in charge. It's about much more than that. It's about the role of the state. It's about the processes and the organizations in place. It's about vibrant civil community and civil society in action. And you only get that organically. I mean, again, the last 2 weeks didn't happen because Minister Tlele, for example, said this community in Durban will work together now. They did it on their own. They decided they were going to defend themselves on their own. And this stuff happens when people realize what is at stake and what they need to do to sort of work together, as it were. And I'm hoping that more and more people see that. Of course, if they don't take ownership of it now, I mean, in all probability, Cape Town might head in the same direction.
That's exactly it. So we talk about spontaneous active citizenship. And I think at one of the DRSA things earlier this year, I said the greatest threat to our democracy is not a tyrannical central government, whether it be ANC or EFF. It's the apathy of the citizens who just neglect to take ownership of their own domain. And your life, your neighborhood, your house, your street, your income, your business, your relations with others, that is your domain. And you should own that. And if you fail to own that, it means that you are absolving, or rather you are deferring that responsibility to someone else, usually someone who is less well equipped to shoulder it than you are, and who certainly may not have honorable motives, or may just be negligent with it. And that's unfortunately what we've seen is and I'm going to sound like a bit of a stuck record, but I think the true legacy of apartheid was breeding a generation of people, many generations that were trained to be subservient, that mustn't question authority, that must not question the official narrative, that must accept and do their part always. And when you do your part, we always talk about you making all the sacrifices and the government reaping all the benefit. So going forward from this, Chris, how would you, in the last 7 minutes we've got left, how would you, or rather, what talking points do you have, or what points do you have in order to encourage people to take ownership of what's theirs? Where can they start? And how do they take it further?
So ideally, it's practical steps. There's a lot to be said for the theoretical discussions, but and this isn't just a case of I want to sort of put it on people that they need to solve the problems of the whole country and the whole world, as it were. This is just taking ownership of small things and taking action. I mean, you can have the theory, you can say, oh, tomorrow I'm going to be motivated. But to me, sort of motivation and action and stuff like that, motivation follows from action. So just try and do some stuff. Speak to people, engage with people, get different ideas from different organizations. We've mentioned a lot of them now. Get the information to make the most informed decisions. I would say there's a lot to be said for things like, on the one hand, getting involved in your community action organization, as it were. And on the other hand, trying to get money offshore. So it doesn't have to be either or. It doesn't have to be, I'm going to emigrate and that's my path. If you decide to do that, I will not blame anyone for that. And that's your right and your life to decide what things you do. But you can make yourself stay proof in certain ways in terms of having some of your wealth overseas, and also making sure that the community and society in which you live is relatively better than what it could be. So civil society organizations, community action networks, organizations like AfriForum, Sakeliga, SAI. Also try and support think tanks like the Free Market Foundation, the Institute of Race Relations, and others who try and influence the macro policy level. So hope against hope, if South Africa moves from 100th on the Economic Freedom of the World Index into 40th in 50 years' time, people's quality of life will be better. And that's what we try and do. That's the sort of direction in which we try and influence South Africa, because we think on average, that'll be better for people's quality of life. So I think you can follow a lot of different paths. There's also a lot to be said for just making sure that you're trained in certain things. And I know some people might be, it might be very intimidating holding a firearm for the first time, and you just need to find someone who understands your sort of aptitude, your characteristics, as it were, and they will teach you the right ways to do it, because no one else can be responsible for you as efficiently as you can be. And I think there's a lot to be said for just trying to learn some measure of self-defense, some measure of self-ownership. And you can always use that in other contexts when you see someone else's life being threatened. If you choose to sort of intervene, as it were. I'm not going to make moral pronouncements as a philosopher and say if you see someone drowning, you have to go and help them, kind of thing. I also think, so to boil it down, information, and from there, just take some small steps that you can to try and figure out how to make sure that no matter what happens with the ANC or the EFF or the DA, whoever else, perhaps Action SA will be the next national government. It shouldn't matter who is in charge that much in terms of what you try and do to improve your own life.
That's exactly it, because even if the Democratic Alliance or Action SA or some free market, freedom-oriented party became national government tomorrow, a government is only as good as the people who hold it accountable. And the only way to hold them accountable is to be active and take ownership and not defer to the state more than is absolutely bloody necessary. I mean, if I didn't have to defer to them, switching my street lights on and off, I wouldn't, because I do not even trust them with that like basic a task. And I think most people can understand why, because even in Cape Town, numerous street lights don't work. So, if it were up to the people living in the street, I can promise you the street lights would never be out if it was under their direct control. Fortunately, it isn't. It's the municipality.
We should also, it's easy for me to say as someone who lives in the suburbs, as it were, and who for the last year could have worked from home. I didn't lose my job because of lockdowns. But just the idea of try not to wish for too efficient a government and too efficient a political party to be in power. To me, there's only one thing more terrifying than a communist, and that's an efficient communist and an efficient busybody who uses the power of the state in good ways to implement their vision for the world. So at least until now, in some ways, we've run into the inefficiency of the government, as it were.
Yeah, that's exactly something that I think people need to realize is don't wish for an efficient nanny, because otherwise you get New Zealand, Australia, or the UK or Canada at this point in time, which is absolutely fine to live in if constant state interference in your personal life doesn't bother you in the slightest. But for someone like me, it would be absolute hell on bloody earth, and I would hate every minute of it, and I'd want to leave, and very quickly. Chris, just last one about the Free Market Foundation is linked in the description below, so people can check out. Just a quick thing about what you guys do and how people can support you, because you do amazing work. You are going to publish something I wrote when Martin's better. I will link it, so everyone who's watching the stream must read it. Okay, that's like my condition. But just give us a rundown of the Free Market Foundation. You guys do good work, and how people can contribute.
No, thanks very much, and thanks again for the opportunity and the discussion. I've enjoyed it very much. Yeah, so the FMF founded in 1975, so quite an old organization at this point, classically liberal, focused on promoting ideas of property rights, the rule of law, positive economic growth, that kind of thing, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of association. I know we don't often like the press, but it's important to have a robust press. And sometimes you see glimpses of light. For those of you who might not be aware, Rebecca Davis from the Daily Maverick wrote a piece over the weekend in which she says, she doesn't have, and I'm paraphrasing, but she doesn't have a libertarian bone in her body. But even she is asking herself, what is the point of government? What, based on the last 2 weeks and even longer, based on the COVID-19 corruption and that kind of thing, what is the point of government? So we need to continually try and influence people, try and engage with them. I mean, ultimately, I think the majority of South Africans want the country to be a good place in which to live. And through the government's failures, they are starting to see that the path of centralization, complete control, isn't the right way to get there. Just in terms of ways of supporting the FMF, if you'd like to donate to the FMF, that would be very much appreciated. Support all of the work we do. You can find all of our articles on our website, which Gideon said he will link to. We also do things like submissions to Parliament. Recently, we presented on the National Health Insurance Bill, if that's something that's of interest to you. So just check out our website to see the areas that we cover. And please try and support in different ways that you can. I mean, something as basic and simple as it were, in terms of sharing an article or a quote by one of us goes a long way. You never know who you might reach and who you might influence. So anything of that would be appreciated. We also have a YouTube channel, and I would encourage people to go and subscribe to that for interviews and discussions with all sorts of different guests. I'm hoping one day we can organize something with Gideon, of course. So look forward to that coming up in due course.
Chris, thank you so much. That's epic. Indeed, Free Market Foundation is linked already in the description below. I'm sure it is. If it isn't, I will make sure it is. And it would always be an honor to come on any of your guys' discussions. It's always a pleasure working with you, working for you, working alongside you. You guys have done incredible heavy lifting for ordinary people in this country. And please carry on doing so. And do please, everyone, support the Free Market Foundation. They're amazing people. Chris, we'll definitely have you back on. I'll chat to Martin in the morning and find out. Well, I'll encourage him to let me know when he's not sickish anymore. And then we can arrange another discussion. I told him he must just debate the virus to death, because Martin will. That is the COVID silver bullet. When you, many of you may not have met Martin yet, you will meet him soon, and you'll understand exactly what I'm talking about. But for everyone that's been here, thank you for tuning in. I'll see you again tomorrow night with Khofu and Temba about Sitrep, Soweto, same time, same place. Stay frosty, stay safe, and see you soon. Bye-bye.